Hello, everyone. Good morning to you, and welcome to Design and Dialogue. My name is Glenn Adamson, and today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Ebby Baralaye to the program. Hello, Ebby. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Calling in from Detroit, new house in Detroit.
Yes.
In your new tabernacle there. So we're just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get going. First of all, do be aware that we have muted everyone to maintain our audio quality. Please say hello and let us know where you're calling in from, if you don't mind, in the chat. We always like to know. And of course, if you have questions for Ebby at the end of the hour, we will take them. So just put them in the chat as we go along and we'll get back to them. This, of course, will be recorded. It is being recorded and will be posted on Friedman Benda's website as early as this afternoon if you want to watch again or send on to friends. And I think that's all of my announcements. So Ebby, hi, good to see you. We've actually been seeing a lot of each other recently, even in person.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. Because as we'll get to at the end of the interview, we have the pleasure of including your work in the current show at Friedman Benda, A New Realism. So we will talk about that. I thought because we had so many images that we might just go ahead and start the PowerPoint now, if that's okay.
Sure.
What I'm hoping we can do is talk about your work both in a kind of biographical context, but also in a philosophical context, because there are so many ideas and emotions, and I think even spiritual insights that both inform the work and arise from it. But hopefully we can couch all of that in a specific discussion of these works. I will also say parenthetically that if folks are interested in hearing more of the kind of 1,000 foot up view, Ebby and I did recently complete an interview for Art Journal, which is out there online, so you can also read that, which I thought was great, Ebby. But maybe you could just start us off by bringing us to this moment, 2006, this work, which I assume is named for John Coltrane.
Yes.
And let us know, like, what was happening for you before you got to this point, and what did this work mean for you when you made it?
Yeah, so this would have been right at, I don't know whether, I think it might have been my sophomore year at RISD. And up until this point, my engagement with clay, you know, I started working with clay when I was in high school for an AP art class. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to create things that are able to exist in space with the kind of dynamic nature that people do. So I'd been doing more drawing up until that point, and just really kind of took to the idea of being able to build things that existed in space with sculpture concentration in high school. I remember specifically the drive behind that, and I don't think I've ever really shared this with anybody, but I thought about the kind of dynamic, the kind of energy that exists in like a musical duo, specifically like a jazz duo. And I was like, I love this back and forth that exists between, you know, the musician, the audience, and the space. And I want to create things that, you know, have that kind of complexity and have that kind of dynamic nature. And why I necessitated, you know, why I connected that with clay. You know, I guess it was partly an emotive and like an emotional thing, but it was also the material that was presented to me as a sculpture concentration in high school. But it's also representative of the way in which the material works. You know, I talk and think a lot about this dialogue between how clay moves and what it does. And there's so many different types of clay. So when I say clay, I'm speaking generally, but you know, you have terracotta, you have porcelain, you have stoneware, and you have the clay's nature over time, from being wet to being leather hard to being dry to being fired, and all the things that happen in the kiln. There's this whole conversation, this whole dance that happens with the material that I was very much drawn to. It's also, you know, at this point was the first time when I had been introduced to the music of John Coltrane, and I remember thinking to myself when I first heard John Coltrane, this is very hard to understand. This is very hard to follow. And a friend of mine by the name of Andy Lee, he's out in California now. I'm going to call him out, but he lent me Giant Steps, John Coltrane's Giant Steps. And I remember one night I couldn't sleep. And so instead of sleeping or trying to force myself to get back to sleep, I put on Giant Steps and I closed my eyes while I listened to it, and it just clicked. It just immediately, just kind of listening to the movement of the notes. It was like following a bee, sort of like this creative thread in his music, kind of flowing along with my mind. And there was this wedding that happened, this sort of conceptually and creatively, from what John Coltrane was doing and kind of like how I was thinking about the kind of abstraction that I was building into my work, that just immediately inspired me and immediately felt like home. And John Coltrane is a figure that I find to be inspiring for a number of reasons. I mean, we talked a bit about A Love Supreme and the nature of sort of like this conceptual connection, this spiritual and conceptual connection in his work. Him being somebody who's really pursuing the transcendent in what he wanted to say and express through his music, while also being, a deeply flawed and, in certain ways kind of like tragic, individual who's lauded to a high degree, both creatively and spiritually now. So I've always been drawn in my work to this blend of representing a certain kind of mortality, a certain kind of brokenness, a certain kind of imperfection, with this striving for a certain kind of like purity or transcendence, through the work or through what you're trying to say. I think clay embodies that well.
Yeah.
I talk about this connection between clay and the body being, infinitely broken and decaying and ultimately destined for death, as well as being sort of like the vessel that encases our souls, something that is eternal and goes beyond just simply the finite nature of the things that we live, within and around.
And Ebby, I noticed compositionally, you've also done this very specific thing here, which we'll see come up a lot in your work, where there are moments of what I want to call anarchy, or the amorphous, the unformed, where the clay is presented as such. So these kind of wrinkled, almost undigested areas. And then there are these moments of discrete contour of decisiveness, even leaning into figuration or possibly ornament, maybe sort of gesturing at those categories from afar. And I'll just go to the next image here, but that polarity between chaos and order seems like an important one in your work. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this back and forth, this kind of dialogue, this conversation that happens, and I think even kind of relating it, to the work of John Coltrane or to jazz, specifically thinking about the musicians and artists that I was drawn to. You have this, act of resolving a certain kind of disharmony or creating a problem, creating like a discordance, and then leading it into a certain kind of resolution or melody that I relate to kind of taking, the nature of clay as what it is, allowing it to be problematic, allowing it to be everything that it is, and then kind of working or speaking alongside and through it, by making very deliberate choices, very deliberate lines, very deliberate, surfaces. So that's a lot of where the sort of like the conceptual wrestling, the conceptual and aesthetic wrestling of my work was like early on, where I kind of allow myself to go into this place of like creating a problem, if you will, and then finding my voice in the solution or finding my voice in the conversation that would happen with the materials. But these two pieces, so this is a Deswa and Casio. So I'd started thinking more about casting my work or working with other materials in addition to clay, or thinking about clay as an intermediary material that I would model in and then cast. And these two pieces were an interesting pivot point for me, because these were initially going to be models for forms that would be cast in bronze. And I remember just being so drawn to the nature of the collaged elements that I was bringing into these works. So it's like a cinder block, and there's part of like a helmet and a headlight and a desuwa, and then there's like a part of a Christmas ornament, and then a shard of clay, and then a piece of foam in Cassia. And you also do have wet clay that's in these pieces. So the brown sections in both pieces around the midsection for Adesue, and then on the side for Kessie, that's actually raw clay that I've allowed to dry and then actually cured with a urethane. So I was thinking about alternative ways of, if you will, not so much firing, but kind of sealing the material. And it was really an exciting point for me to step away from working in just one medium, but also to think about alternative ways of approaching clay itself as a medium in conversation with other processes.
And yet you also, right along, had been working in a vessel tradition. So we have that sort of assemblage, sculpture, draftsmanly assemblage that we've just seen. And here we have a series of images of these kind of bottle or vase forms, which seem quotational to me of ceramic history. Also shift from terracotta, which I'm hoping we'll get back to as a very meaningful material to you, but here working in porcelain. So can you talk a little bit about the polarity between the vessel form and more free sculptural explorations in your work?
Yeah, I wasn't drawn at all to wheel throwing when I was first presented with it as something that I, would have to learn as a part of my ceramics major. I was much more inclined to create things that had a certain kind of like asymmetry to them that really explored what was possible, in working with like the dynamic nature of clay. So I saw the symmetry of, working on the potters was being pretty limited. But once I learned the discipline, I came to really be drawn to that canon, that vessel-like canon, that I then adapted into the slipcast pieces that we were just looking at. And even now, here to this piece here, Abram, where I'm taking the same kind of like, canon, if you will, where it's like you have the neck and the body. I'm thinking about it as being purely sculptural. So by falling by being really drawn to, I was going to say falling in love. I was like, oh, I don't want to over romanticize this, but it's clay, so I guess I can. But we're really being drawn to both the discipline and the canon of creating the vessel. I then brought that into the sort of dialogue or conversation that I've been having, I guess, stylistically with this kind of like disharmony and resolution of that disharmony in my more sculptural work, as you see specifically with this piece, Abram.
And here also a transmutation of material into the nickel-plated bronze, so almost like a Jeff Koons level of sort of spectacle that's been submitted to this very, as you just said, this form that seems to be a contrast between the beautiful silhouette and profile and the sort of torn material as such. This is a real outlier in at least my mind. I'd love to hear you talk about this because it's like a moment of pop reference maybe, but also seems like everyday life creeping in. So yeah, I never seen these works before, so I'd love to hear about them.
Yeah, I mean, this piece kind of reminds me of our first conversation in Cranbrook. We were talking about a different piece. I believe it was titled One Piece, but we had a thread of our conversation touched on humor and comedy and sort of like the structure of a joke relating to like the structure of sort of like meaning in a particular piece. But with this work in particular, I'm kind of taking like an emoji, something that we're very familiar with existing in the digital space, and giving it a very kind of like physical seat, a very physical home, and doing kind of like this blunt layering of something that has a very symbolic kind of meaning to it, on top of a form that could be thought of as being more sort of nuanced, more subtle, or even more poetic in how it's speaking. But like the underlying form for both of these pieces, it's incredibly abstract, incredibly like visceral. And then on top of it, these almost like kitsch symbols. So in a way, it was like a joke for me. Like I talk about the over romanticization of clay, and here I'm like I'm doing it. I'm allowing that over romanticization that people talk about. I didn't find clay, clay found me. I'm using it both as a joke, but also as its reality, here. So there's a connection between the two, but also a repulsion between the two pieces. And I'm not, I guess for me, it was important to go there, because that's a lot of where my mind goes and how I think of, both comedy and humor. But also like, I'm just not, I'm not afraid of that contrast. And I think allowing myself to express that contrast was important for me at this time. This was in graduate school, like typical kind of like challenging myself, asking myself questions. So I don't see this as being like the meat of my work, but it was a very important kind of like inflection point for me to be able to explore. And something that I do always think about revisiting, like as much as I think of humor, it doesn't always come through in my work. So yeah, this might come through some more in the future.
Kind of a revealing moment, as I think is this. And this piece I do remember from when it was made, and this idea of a kind of framing gesture.
Mm,
And I've always thought of these as like miniature exhibitions, like one work exhibitions that are presented
mm.
to you on the wall. And obviously very much about a kind of precise contextualism.
Yeah, yeah. Again, this was a time when I was like, I was in a very transient season of my life. So this piece, not one piece, it's about sort of thinking of what it means to accept being one part of a greater, more broad context. I mean, I talk about just having bought a home, and the thing that you do when you buy a home is you just start putting things everywhere. And that's kind of how we allow ourselves to feel more comfortable in the context and a scenario. We spread out either literally by placing things around ourselves that are ours and that we're familiar with, or emotionally or figuratively. So this is kind of a way for me to embrace the fact that, or embrace the ways in which I'm a different person in every context. I'm a different person at home, in my studio, in the classroom, in the critique space, and just allowing myself to acknowledge being present in different ways, in different scenarios, while also reconciling that to the fact that I am still always the same person. I am still always the same individual. I think the ways in which we do that is specific for every person. Like I know you're somebody who travels around a lot, but the way in which you relate to your home where you are now, and the way in which you relate to the various spaces that you inhabit as a curator, as somebody who works in the field of the arts, that's something that I think is really important to intentionally embody. So this I guess this art piece was my way of starting to map that out for myself, or kind of have a conversation about it with myself, and then also with you, because this was the first piece.
Yeah.
This is the piece where I first met and had a conversation with you.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's also, I guess, something in that Project One piece where there's an analog between the physical object that you're creating, and not the whole object, but the clay, and yourself. So this idea of what I just called a precise contextualization is also maybe a way of thinking about that idea of where you are and who you are in a
Mm,
specific like nexus of time space. And I feel like that is such a persistent theme in the work since, including the things that you're making now. So I'll just go through a few images here, um, but I'd love to hear you talk about the object as a stand-in for the self,
mm,
and the different
mm.
ways that you angle at that possibility.
Yeah, yeah. I would say with this piece, this was actually this body of work,
Mhm.
was me sort of entering in a space where I was allowing my work to be a little bit more self-referential in this piece, specifically, Beji Ori. It was significant for me because it was a reflection on my own personal, like my own history and my own ancestry. So I was born in Nigeria. I'm of the Yoruba people. Ori means head, and the Beji is Yoruba for twin. And there's this understanding. So I guess the Yoruba people and the Nigerians, there's a large occurrence of twinning in births, and twins are believed to be, traditionally speaking, the reincarnation of deity. And my mother, I thought she had twins. She had triplets that died, and creating these statuettes is a way of sort of embodying and continuing to revere the identity and the spiritual energy of those twins. But it's also an opportunity for me to think about my sort of like my ancestral spiritual inheritance and the icons that have represented that kind of engagement, and the way in which that's been encoded into my spiritual engagement now, and sort of taking on the realization that's like I can reframe that iconography, or I can make it incredibly personal, because I'm working with these same materials: clay, metal, wood. I can define these things for myself, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm kind of taking the idea of the Ebeji statuette, and I'm remaking it in a way that's very much specific to my own history, and specifically to these, well, again, these siblings of mine who had passed away. But also kind of thinking about this academic split where you have like the plaster form on the pedestal, and challenging that too here, where the pedestal is really high. There's sort of a kind of a posture of veneration, rather than a posture of approachability here, but the form that's being sort of focused on is this kind of abstracted head form that doesn't allow for the kind of investigation, or the kind of categorization that you'd be used to in like a plaster bust or a more classical form.
Yeah, and I understand that in Yoruba thought and life, the term Ori means head, but it also means a lot more than that. And I suppose we maybe talk about this in a somewhat parallel way, like headspace, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But the term Ori also implies a kind of spiritual axis, and also a sense of self, or a sense of identity. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the head is believed to be the seat of the soul.
Right.
So in a lot of Yoruba work, the head is oversized to represent that significance, and that in importance. And I've been reflecting lately with one of the pieces that's in the New Realism show, then this nickname that my father gave me of being like big head. I've always been somebody who's very much existed, in my head, which is probably why it's so big. But I also think it's relevant to how I've processed change and transition throughout a lot of my life. Like I've moved around a lot. Like a lot of my work has to do with this act of sort of like migration and movement. And the one space that I've been able to control and remain consistent is this headspace, is this world in which I'm thinking about, thinking about and making art. So that headspace has been a significant sort of like home for me throughout the various transitions, the various geographic transitions that I've kind of like moved throughout my life. So it's significant ancestrally, but also significant specifically for me, because it's been a place of consistency across a life of a lot of change. And I guess so here we're looking at context. I talk about the different spaces that so I was born in Nigeria, lived in the Caribbean, and have kind of navigated my way around the United States. And one of the moves that I did not really expect to make, but really leaned into, was my move to San Francisco. And here with this piece, Context Tenderloin, using, taking the intimacy of clay that we're familiar with, in the forms of things that are very close to the body. So cups, bowls, plates, and now kind of creating these, forms that are almost like abstractions of, the left and right foot, and using it to map the neighborhood that was immediately local to my apartment. So taking that intimacy and using it as a tool to relate to the geography and the environment around where I live, literally going into the streets and setting these items up as kind of like a record of my own migration in a very local way, but also in a very present way in my neighborhood.
Yeah, so it's a real indexing or marking practice. And here, I mean, to me, this implies a similar strategy, but one that's maybe more interiorized, or possibly even domestic, maybe sentimental would be a word that you'd accept.
Oh yeah, yeah. I loved making this piece. I literally made this piece in my bedroom, as you can tell.
Yeah.
And it's titled that material life, and for me, it was almost like this way of it almost goes back to the "You're the Best" piece, where I'm speaking into this deep romanticization of materiality. You have like the flowers here and the pillows, these kind of elements that speak to a very familiar, kind of intimacy, but literally layered and embedded with these almost like clay teardrops, if you will, that kind of like form this ring moving up this form. And of course, you have this picture, this kind of ready-made object that's right in the middle. And yeah, in a way, it's like, but this also even alludes back to the Coltrane piece, where in a way I'm kind of creating a scenario, a problem, if you will, and allowing myself to resolve it. But I think what's significant specifically about this piece is its connection to domesticity. It's the way in which I'm meditating, or rather kind of reflecting on how so much of how we relate to materials starts in the domestic space and goes from there. The ways in which we think of intimacy, the ways in which we kind of think of function and utility, the ways in which we emote through all these things starts first and foremost from literally the cradles that we're in, the beds that we sleep on, and kind of go, from that point. So I think it's really kind of like significant for me to kind of create this piece, because it kind of grounded from a domestic standpoint, this connection between the homes and this idea of dwelling, and how we understand materiality and things that go far beyond, the home, like much more beyond the home.
So I wanted to ask you something, Ebby, on a sort of larger level, because already at this point in the talk, I think the audience will be getting a sense of the variety of your work and the uncontainability of the genre, compositional sensibility. It's very unpredictable, and I'm sure as people are like waiting to see what the next slide will be, that they probably don't have much in terms of expectation, which is part of the practice. And I guess what I wanted to ask you about was, maybe this image is a good one to jump off of, that of course in contemporary practice we've come to accept that, and that cross-disciplinarity is the norm, and artists can't be put in a box, and we sort of understand that. But I wanted to ask you if you felt that there was a politics, specifically in your case, to the very act of variation, and your self-assignation of the opportunity to explore all of these worlds, to be sentimental, to track your own passage through the world, to actually engage in moments of self-portraiture as well. Because I want to say that for a Black man who's mainly headquartered in the ceramics world, although often exploring around it, that puts you in a very singular position. And I feel like the very polymorphousness of the work has itself a kind of political message behind it in that sense, like a sort of anti-typecasting, almost like an anti-racial profiling, if you will. And I wonder what you think of that idea.
Yeah, I never thought of it specifically in that way, but I do see a particular kind of contrast, a particular kind of like duality when it comes to materials that's represented throughout my work, where there's this conversation between soft and hard, with the clay, the metal, the wood, and then working with burlap and soft materials and certain ready-made objects. I will say too that some of the diversity that's represented throughout my work as far as materials has to do with the way in which I would see and think about the environments I lived in and lived throughout. I spent a lot of time looking at things, and I know that might sound like a very general thing to say, but I'm somebody who would walk down my street and notice like a discarded muffler or a piece of, a gnarled bit of a root. And these are things that I literally brought into some of the earlier pieces that we were looking at, Kessie and Adesua, that I literally brought into the work. But one of the things that excites me is being able to collage and bring in this kind of like dialogue that's happening already in the world, as sort of like thoughts and information for my work. And that's not limited to anything. The nature of what we confront, the nature of what we find, like I talk about the work being able to exist in space. So a part of existing sort of in the dynamic nature of space and environment is kind of using, or rather being confronted by what's around you and what's there. So I'm very much open from a material standpoint, but there is this specific kind of duality where I'm specifically drawn to like clay and wood and metal, but also like working with like fabric and textiles. So I don't know if I'd so much call it or kind of think of it as being political, but I think almost like this polarity presents this balance that's been significant for me conceptually to go back and forth between, but I don't always see the divide. And I say that like even with this piece, I was so on Ori Fire Petrita, this piece is about sort of me thinking about what it means to just in between. So Ori again means head, the far means bridge, and Petrita means fatherland in Greek. So I'm thinking about what it means to exist in between this idea of where I'm ancestrally and biologically rooted and where I find myself now, and so like the instability of that existence, hence the two kind of like pedestals that support the one bridge form. But I guess the way in which I think of the materials and the concepts that drive my work, whether it's ceramics or in this case not ceramic at all, to me are of course so wedded that I was talking with the curator about including this piece in a show, ceramic show, and didn't even dawn that there are no ceramics in this. It didn't dawn on me at all. And there's a certain way in which I kind of had to pause and say, well, but there's like when you think of clay and it being sort of like the product of decomposition of or natural and organic things that we find in the earth, I kind of tie that the sort of foundational nature of it as a medium and the foundational nature of these other elements I'm working with as being more cohesive than as being disparate. Yeah. So even for me, there isn't this divide when like, oh, I work in clay, but I'm also kind of working in these other materials. I see there being a significant through line in all the materials that I'm working with, as well as a significant connection in all the materials that I'm working with. So it's not, I mean, yeah, it doesn't feel haphazard in my own mind. It feels, yeah. Sometimes I do push myself, but I see more of a through line in all the materials that are intentional, sort of like polarity in them.
Yeah, maybe one way of putting it might be that the motivations that lead you to use clay in a certain way are also present in using this tonal series of textiles. The point that you were just making about looking at things and allowing the environment to, in a way, seep into your work, be present in your work, is very, I think, very explicitly present in this series of objects. So here, fount, and then it's more found object-oriented project, which is a very striking, like to me, this is a sort of austere endpoint of your practice, this engagement with the folding chair and sheathing it in clay. And then I'll show one final piece in this little passage, which is these stacked forms. Would you be able to talk about this group of objects together as a kind of collecting of the evidence of that kind of observation that you were just describing a moment ago?
No, I think that puts it well. For me, yeah, it's kind of like this. It's this reflection on how I look at things. But also recognizing the way in which I see things is always conditioned by how I'm living relative to them. So even with so the found piece is kind of like a it's almost like an adaptation of Duchamp's piece, and then you have the folding chair, which again the folding chair for me kind of speaks to this kind of life that I've embodied of transience and thinking of the transient nature of clay, and those two things being literally layered, into and on top of each other, and then the stacked tubes. So you have this kind of like these like two, the same objective shape, but represented in two different materials, and one having a very specific kind of configuration, and the other having a very different kind of configuration. So all these ways of kind of looking and thinking about how the way I see is affected by the conditions within I'm living, are things that are, I guess it's all highlighted for me, the significance of the city, which almost sounds like a weird or odd thing to say. You might think of, I guess this Duchampian perspective of the ready-made sort of existing in this objective realm, It's almost like a challenge to that, where instead of it being this kind of like cold thing, it's this incredibly subjective, pointy, active, you know, thing. And then the folding chair both invites a certain kind of engagement, but also repels it because of the cracking, you know, of the clay. I'd say for me, like a significant pivot is realizing that so much of the way in which I think and work as an artist has to do with the city I live in. It has to do with the condition, my conditions of being present and dwelling in a place. The studio isn't this objective space that I walk into and becomes a void for my ideas. I bring the way I see and the way I kind of process what I see as a result of as a result of the environment that I'm living within and around. Yeah.
And yet you also, it's very striking that you included these two images. So this graphite work, very much feeling like a drawing, although a drawing meaning a painting, I suppose. And then this figural sculpture very early.
Mm.
Take it, you introduced here partly to denote your grounding in a certain set of studio-based practices and maybe even academic practices. But yeah, I mean, this particular work has a very different kind of energy because of its medium, although we can also
Mm.
see connections to some of the sculptural work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of slides of my drawing work, but you know, and kind of thinking about this way in which I kind of start in the place of being very open. I start in the place of this sort of saturating or kind of approaching a lot of information,
Mm.
and then finding a resolution through it. The earliest way in which I navigated that was through these drawings, was through these sketches, where I kind of allow myself from a physical standpoint to just kind of create a lot of information and then pull through and edit things that became significant for me as I kind of like distilled and worked through the composition. I kind of joke that, you know, when I first realized I was an artist and I had scribbled on this sheet of paper, and then I pointed to one of my classmates and said, "Look, there's a horse in there." And she kind of looked at me as if I was crazy. And I still believed there was a horse in there. The fact that she looked at me as if I was crazy didn't, you know. I was like, oh, I guess this is like I see something that she does not. But I wanted to include this piece just to kind of speak to the significance of drawing as a way for me to kind of navigate this process of thinking, this process of kind of like distilling ideas of abstraction before I ever got to working with clay or other kind of more sculptural materials.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I feel like if I were going to, go and curate your mid-career survey at this point, I might put this drawing next to the chair in a funny way, like this
Just
like Apollo and Dionysius thing about the different modalities of the work. Um, and this early seated figure in relation to this piece, which is again so amorphous and seems so offhand and sort of almost, I mean, I don't know if you actually made it look like squeezed in the palm, very, very direct in comparison to that earlier, more learned type of figuration.
yeah. With preface to a suggestion, I'm thinking specifically about the poetics of the material of clay, and kind of allowing myself to, rather than just like engage in those poetics as I'm building and working with material, to actually use the material to speak about those poetics.
Mhm.
You know, like I'm not I'm not I'm not I'm not a I'm not a poet. I kind of wish if I could be anything besides an artist, I'd probably want to be a poet or a musician. But in a way, this piece has the kinetics of that kind of like, you know, through line that I described, you know, when listening to John Coltrane's Giant Steps for the first time. The seated figure was really, yeah, that was 2001. That was one of my earliest pieces, and it's kind of me. It's a very loose self portrait. I didn't necessarily work with myself as the model, but I think it was significant that I was thinking first of clay as being representative of the body, and then going from there into thinking further and beyond about abstraction. But so much of how I approach the material has to do with relating to it as an extension of a sense of both physical identity, but also kind of like metaphysical identity as well.
So, and then here, this still life, I guess, would again be about that precise relationship between the physical and the metaphysical. It's like a transformation of the one into the other through the application of material, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Like this is one of those pieces that was like it's really important for me to make. So here I'm thinking of the drill as almost like existing of as a shadow of itself. I mean, I love drills. I have two, and I was trying to convince myself to invest in another two. So there's this very kind of like activated. There's this very like activated element in the artist studio or in the workshop that project a very specific sense of engagement, a very specific sense of utility. And my whole thought is that like these things, even when they're not being utilized, even when they're not being used, still project that sense of agency and still project that sense of utility. So we think a lot about, I think a lot about sort of like function and this disconnect in, a Western idea of design between sort of utility and a certain kind of like emotional and spiritual agency. And I guess the truth is the things that we surround ourselves with, like I'm staring at my vacuum cleaner right now and my broom, so much of the way in which we categorize these things has to do with how we use them. But even when they're not being utilized in sort of traditional standpoint, they still project a certain kind of almost ontological, agency and energy into our living environments and into our lives. So, I'm distilling that, I'm thinking about that. But at the same time, it was interesting for me, again, this is a piece that I needed to make to kind of like, kind of pinpoint a certain sort of like a conceptual idea that I wanted to explore, but much more philosophically, couched than becoming sort of like a springing point for like a whole body of work.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is similar to the folding chair, I suppose, although the subject matter is different. There's a similar sense of marking the reality of our surroundings in a way, in a comparatively uninflected manner as well. So the idea that it becomes a shadow of itself, I suppose. Yeah. So here we have an example of you wood firing, Ebby. So every ceramist has to do it, I guess. But another super powerful form, but also with this, I think for you, somewhat unconventional surface on it. So it gives different kind of skin on the object.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned a lot about this kind of dialogue between that exists in the processes of making. So the first time I fired a wood kiln was actually at the art center that I'm about to head to this coming week, Peters Valley. They have one of the oldest wood kilns in the country there. But there's this very, an onigami kiln is traditionally built into a hill, fired with wood over several days. So there's this whole, this is very kind of like intense, they're all the intense sort of like factors and qualities that go into just how that kiln is fired to begin with and where the flame is going and where works are positioned, but also the kind of community and the kind of collaboration that needs to exist even to make that kind of, even to fire, that kind of a kiln. So for me, it's always interesting when I would fire, thinking about the ways in which the material transforms, because these pieces went in completely raw, so no glaze on them whatsoever. And we traditionally think of ceramic objects, at least the ceramic objects that we're familiar with in our homes, as having a particular type of glaze on them, one that's usually kind of like consistent. I enjoy having the surface be a natural expression, still a process. And I think wood firing really leans into that, because where a piece is positioned in a kiln, how it's hit by the flame, what kind of wood you're using, how long you fire for it. These are all things that then are reflected on the surface of the work, and you see the kind of variety that you get as a result. So I see wood firing as being this kind of like very kind of like powerful wedding of both like the act of leaning into this dialogue of the unknown and into the nature of the material in the process of building, as well as in the process of firing and in the community that's significant to both those things, building as well as firing. So I think I'm gonna miss the wood. I think the wood firing that's gonna happen in Peters Valley happens later or just before I arrive. But it'll be nice revisiting that wood kiln nonetheless.
It is amazing, the wood firing, because it's the community sort of gathered around an unseen core, because of course what's happening
Mm,
in the kiln is by definition not accessible. And so it does have this real kind of implicit religiosity, like a kind of shrine-like dynamic. Um,
yeah.
okay,
Mm,
so now
mm,
we're sort of entering the last quarter of the of the interview already, which is
mm,
goes too fast. But um, here's a series of works that, at least to me, connect to your Ori head works, but perhaps propose a different level of abstraction. And also now
mm,
you're exploring, again, yet a different set of surfaces and materials that maybe are a little bit more the idiom that you're working in now. Um,
mm,
so
mm.
to me, there's a kind of real moment of clarity and resolution that happened around this point in your career. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I feel like there's a sort of rings like a bell suddenly in a different way um, than some of the other exploratory pieces.
Oh,
Um,
say that last sentence again.
I
Sorry.
feel like it rings like a bell in a way
Mm.
that some of the other explorations seem more open, and this seems very like on point and focused, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I wonder whether you agree with that, just as in terms of your own experience of your work developing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'd say with this piece, and with some of the works that I was making around this time, I was still kind of exploring this idea. So yeah, this is with this piece as well, maping
Yeah.
of taking forms that evoke a certain kind of utility or a certain kind of categorization as being like a vase or being some certain kind of like functional form that we're familiar with, and then muting that idea of function. So with both of these pieces, they don't have an opening, so you're only able to read or understand them as being, sculptures, as being a certain kind of like nodes. But they kind of exist in somewhat almost like a problematic way. Like they're one thing but not quite, you know. So they're resolved in the fact that they're fully contained. They have kind of like the completeness of being a certain kind of like functional form, but then they kind of like negate what you would expect to be so like a defining element of that form. So again, I'm kind of investigating a certain kind of divide, maybe that I personally relate to this divide again between sort of how I place my sense of presence from an ancestral standpoint to a contemporary standpoint, but also this divide between the things that we understand to have a certain kind of agency in being defined in a specific functional way, and the ways in which these things and these objects evoke that agency even when they don't get to, or even when they aren't looked to utilize or actualize that function. So in a way, nest, again, it kind of looks like a functional form, but it's almost representative of the chest or the body, if you will. And then Maping, again, it looks like the Chinese, Maping vase form, but it becomes almost like another Ori piece.
Yeah.
In fact, the striation that's there is intentionally included as a way of speaking to this urban aesthetic of these striations as being sort of like beauty marks, too. So yeah, there's even though there's this distinct kind of completeness there, there's almost kind of like a complication of that completeness because these things are kind of hard to place in
Yeah.
a way.
Well, in particular, this one has the explicit relationship, as you said, to Chinese porcelain,
Mhm.
that functional form, but also this West African patterning language and the idea, as you said, of the Ori. So it's got a kind of cross-cultural or global
mm
complexity to it.
mm
So
mm
maybe
mm.
somewhat related piece here. This also reminds me of your very first move into those kinds of abstract figural forms, and the idea of the twin seems to return here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with Animus Ori, I guess I was thinking specifically too about. I mean, I talk a lot about sort of spirituality in my work, and I've had to really, I guess, be more clear with myself in recognizing that I resonate so strongly with the sort of as aesthetic sort of like rhythms and elements of I guess spiritual objects, whether they be statuettes, stools, shrines, whatever they might be. of Yoruba culture, but that I'm not connected to the actual engagement of these things in a spiritual way. Like I'm not, I'm not an animist. I don't practice indigenous Yoruba, faith or spirituality, while recognizing that the way in which I think of materials and the way in which I think of abstraction, and sort of like the way in which I kind of deconstruct those things and construct those things creatively very much has to do with archaeology to biology, sort of like the way in which I relate to directly and indirectly that ancestry. But I think it's important for me to recognize that I'm relating to like the nature, but not always to the specific substance of the kind of types of spirituality or like the spiritual elements that I'm referencing, or speaking to kind of just kind of owning that there is a hybridity there, but that hybridity is very specific in how it's reflected.
Yeah, it might just be worth saying for those that don't know that, because what you just said might sound a little bit like you're coming from a sort of standard atheist contemporary artist position, but that's actually not the case. It's that you have a different spiritual basis, not rather.
I'm a Christian. Yeah, I'm a Christian. As my mother went to Catholic school as a child, and it was really through her, just seeing her relationship with the Bible, seeing her relationship with Scripture, that really sort of convicted me and impacted me growing up. But thinking of like this kind of significance of the body of Christ and the physicality of things as being sort of like important. Like I think a lot about the Caravaggio piece, the incredulity of St. Thomas, where Christ shows up and Thomas insists on digging his finger. It's a very invasive painting. See Thomas digging his finger into Christ's side, and I love that piece. It's like, yes, like the spiritual must become physical. I wouldn't say it must, but actually in a very like significant, important way, in my spiritual tradition as a Christian, Christ needed to become a person, in order to fulfill the role that he came to fulfill as a savior. So in a way, I also relate that to kind of like the dynamic that happens in the studio, where it's not enough for these ideas to just simply exist, as ideas. They need to become real. If the ideas were enough, we wouldn't make anything. Right. So in a way, in my studio, I'm doing that prodding where I'm sticking my finger into the side of my idea, in a way, and seeing it manifest into physical form.
Yeah, I wanted to flip to this this body of work that comes in and out of text and pattern. So again, I'll flick through a few of these, so people get a sense of this body of work, or I think of it as a body of work anyway. But it seems to me exactly what you were just saying, but in a particular context, which is to materialize language. So here we have an idea and also a sentiment. Now what? Right? What now? So this sense of open-ended doubt, uncertainty that has been fixed in this impermeable and, as you said, very committed form of materiality, fired ceramic.
Yeah, this is a great counterpoint to I guess, what we were just talking about, because what now is almost like a prayer for me. It's probably my most my most common prayer, like what now? But it's also like a provocation, so you can even think of like the aggressive nature, of Thomas, with the aggressive nature of just kind of life and the things that prompt our prayers, coupled with this kind of like, just uncertainty or unknowing. But here in working with text, and this is, this is a point that I was, I guess a point or a place that I was particularly intrigued by, just kind of seeing how language shifts in meaning when interpreted into and through a different material.
And I'm just, as promised, I'm just showing this body of work that also deals with pattern. And I think people see the isomorphism or similarity between these patterned works, this one suggesting a maze, and the text works. So they both seem like a kind of writing and articulation. I always think about the word articulate when I think about you, Ebby, not only you as a person, but also you as a maker, that your work seems to speak, sometimes more clearly, sometimes less clearly, sometimes expressing doubt or confusion, sometimes expressing a sense of spiritual conviction, but always speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to ask you to speak about this particular work. This is currently on view in Objects USA 2020, another show that I helped to curate that's on in New York right now at Art and Company Gallery, and has a very, I don't know, kind of unforgettable, emblematic quality to it. And I see it as related, perhaps in some ways, to the mazes and the text pieces that we've been looking at, but also it seems to stand apart in some way. I'd love to ask you about the motif of the serpent and the derivation of this piece.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the serpent is kind of seen as being this symbol of both like good and evil, depending on the mythological tradition or creation myth, or sort of like context within which you're looking at it. So I guess in a way, I was drawn to that. I was drawn to sort of like the potent nature of the serpent, as a symbol. But it's interesting seeing this after looking at the text pieces, because I didn't even just sort of looking at what now, and then the maze pieces and now this, because there's a deconstruction of what it means for something to become a symbol. Like if you think of text as really just a language, a certain sort of like structure of lines, a certain structure of patterns that takes on a particular kind of meaning. Here with serpent, I'm kind of taking the symbol of the serpent and kind of moving it back into this deconstructed space of like the fundamental elements that make it what it is. So there's as much focus on the nature of what's being represented here as being a snake, as there is on its particular kind of configuration, this kind of sinuous, quality. So you almost relate to the pattern as quickly as you relate to what it is, which is being a serpent. And I specifically wanted there to be a little bit of a tension there, with like you want to kind of classify this piece with a certain kind of like apprehension, fear, anxiety, or kind of like connotations that you would make with the snake. But then you're thinking about its structure, which is much more flat, which kind of relates more to almost kind of like Egyptian kind of like abstraction. And specifically the texture of the scales that remove you, and also the texture of the clay that remove you out of simply reading it as being a serpent, and reading it as being form, reading it as being line, reading it as being sort of like a configuration of information that's still subjective, but that shifts in subjectivity from like the motive nature of it being a snake to the motive nature of it being made of a particular type of material, the motive nature of the terracotta and it being clay. So I think that's what was important for me, kind of like almost like co-opting the emotive sort of momentum of the idea of a serpent and weaving that into the emotive momentum of the material itself, into the terracotta.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't mind, just because we only have a few minutes left, could we close out by talking about this issue of materiality? And I'll just sort of accelerate here into the last of the bodies of work, which is the group of pieces that we have on view at Friedman Benda now in A New Realism. So feels real, this terracotta. Again, a very suitable textual support for the discussion that we're having. Can you talk about this iron-rich clay terracotta and its relationship to not only these works that we've been looking at, including this raw clay one, but then this body of work that you're making now? And obviously we're not just talking about terracotta here, but also dark glazes on stoneware and the whole idea of the clay body and the human body and their relationship to one another. Let's close out with that theme.
Yeah. I mean, and thinking about terracotta and thinking of iron-rich clays, I'm always drawing this connection between clay and ideas of earth. So thinking of land and place, as well as thinking of the body, particularly myself as a dark-skinned individual, as a person of color. So I'm kind of making this very direct kind of connection between the materiality of clay and the materiality of dwelling and the materiality of identity. And I see that most strongly represented in iron-rich clays, in that way, but also kind of thinking of like the patterns that I'm working with, and kind of like the lines and symbols that are being represented in everything from like the slip, so like the more so like painterly expression of slip on some of the other vessel pieces, to even this. We have a pattern that kind of speaks to sort of more fabric-oriented kind of structure. And I think to me, the iron and the way it speaks to this idea of body and the way it speaks to this idea of land always always kind of takes me back to this understanding that this came from the earth. I never want to abstract the material from its origin or from this place or this understanding of origin. And I guess in a world of seeing ceramic objects with a certain kind of sheen or polish, in Target or, in our just really wherever, it's always important for me to sort of root the material nature of the things that I'm working with, specifically with clay, back to land and back to the body, and working with these iron rich clays. That's always top of mind. It's always very much present for me.
That's so well said. Thank you, Evie. And then the other thing that you did in this particular group of work is to chart a transit or spectrum, not that it's one direction, it's multi-directional, but a spectrum or space between the vessel, the profile, the silhouette, and then the actual articulated face vessel, we could say, which clearly relates to the famous precedent of the African American face jug of the 19th century, but also has a kind of independence from that tradition, partly by virtue of the fact that it's not a jug, so it's open at the bottom, but doesn't have any kind of functional quality. So it's as much sculpture as it is, quote, face jug. And I wanted to just ask you this one last question. Why put these powerful facial sculptures in relation to those more abstract vessels that we were just looking at? What does the juxtaposition do in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the vessel is foundational in the way in which we understand what it means to be rooted as individuals and as a people. It speaks to a certain kind of organization of society, a certain kind of way of being present. It's probably one of the earliest functional things that were made out of clay, the vessel form. So we see reflected in these early creations, in like these early vessel forms, the very things that have gone on to identify the way in which we kind of relate to land, relate to each other, the way in which we see and understand ourselves. So this connection between the vessel and the face, it's always like, I see the connection as being strong because the two always speak to each other. And in a way, these portrait pieces start off for the most part as being vessels and then take on a face as they're completed, if you will. And even with all the portrait pieces, they all have an opening, they all have a top. It's a way of speaking to the inspiration of these as being kind of rooted in the face jug, but also seeing the body once again as being this abstraction of the vessel. I'm thinking of the body as like a broken vessel from a spiritual standpoint, or sort of like a vessel from the standpoint of being something imbued with purpose, imbued with a certain kind of spiritual identity and agency, that has a value, a purpose, a significance that's itself, eternal, or kind of goes beyond the limited nature of its actual physicality or materiality. So the vessel becomes like a metaphor for a certain kind of transcendence, a certain kind of beyond, but it's always conditioned in something that's very present. It's always conditioned in something that's very familiar. And I think that divide, that kind of connection, so like the domestic, and the spiritual, the eternal, that kind of like through line, if you will, is something that's always been, I'd say, particularly important for me to express through my work. I'm never just up in the clouds, and I'm never just sort of in this place just thinking about the materiality, but always kind of like thinking about how the way in which we're present with everything from the doorknobs that we live with, like I'm looking at my windowsill right now, like the bowl that's in front of me, and how that then affects or colors, if you will, the way in which I think about materials, the way in which I think of identity, the ways in which I think of place and spirituality beyond dwelling, beyond sort of like the common and the immediate, into the transcendent and into the eternal. So Yeah. I mean, I think it's really I think smart to pair the two, because of how closely they speak, in nature to one another.
Yeah. Let me just go through them one last time. And I promise we take a couple of questions. We are a little over time, but I want to take certainly this question from Ashwini Bhatt, our colleague, great ceramic artist. And
Yeah.
she's curious if you see the visible markings of the making, as we see particularly in these vessel forms. You see the visible markings of the making as a transparent self. So how do you think of the imparting the marks into the surface as part of this self-portraiture project?
Yeah. Oh, it's so important for those pieces. Because I think they just, they just, yeah, the piece is just that much stronger, as a representation of not only process but specifically like my hands. The
Yeah.
texture is an sort of an encoded reflection of a certain kind of presence, that kind of like helps. Well, it reflects the fact that every single point of the piece was touched by me, and I'm leaving that evidence there, and you're seeing that in the piece. But I like the way you put it, Shwini, that this is kind of like a transparent, being sort of like representing a transparent self. I feel like that's really well put, and that's very much what I'm going for.
Yeah. And just to close out the conversation, I guess, unfortunately, um, just to say that these pieces are opening up a whole new territory of exploration for you potentially. So it's a body of work that will continue, and that
Mm,
um, it's also coming out of not just any moment, because the past year has been so turbulent for all of us, you being no exception. And I know the passing of your father had a major impact on the development of this work as well. Um,
yeah.
so there's a lot of what I want to call it, like a deep well of biography that's bound up in this work.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think about my father as embodying so many of the things that we've kind of talked about, relative to like identity and presence and materiality. And when you lose a loved one, you're kind of processing it for the rest of your life. And I had a very kind of complicated relationship with my father, but I appreciate, uh, that that so much of my, I guess, comfort of living with these questions, and navigating these questions and these conversations has to do with the foundation that he laid, for me as an individual and as a man. So in sort of strong, in a big way, when I look at a lot of these pieces, I see threads of him as well as threads of myself, and thinking about what it means for me to exist as a Black man in America today. I see that as being, sort of much more defined by the man he was and the way he lived, than the conditions and the politics that we live, within and around. Even though that definitely comes, that definitely, brings a heavy bearing on it. But even the way in which I think about how I navigate as a body, as an individual, in our current political, climate. Um, sure, I'm responding to what's going on out there and around there, but I'm very much a product of my father, probably more than I want to be. you know, and so when I think of my sense of body, when I think of my sense of identity, when I think of the ways in which I'm perceived in this society and culture, it really starts first, in a lot of ways, with how I've looked at my father as being the other, Black male figure who has existed in my life,
Yeah.
and then see myself, and then see society. So it's very much that back and forth again, more than I ever thought it would be or even wanted to be. It's like I see him, I
Yeah.
see myself, and I see society, and it's that sort of triangle, that, yeah, adds its own particular complexity to everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, a triangulation that's also a mirroring. So very
Yeah.
complicated shape there. Yeah. Well, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that, Ebby. What an amazing conversation, and so great to have you in our show. Great to have this opportunity to share the time with you, and I hope people will have a chance to come and see the work, and also just looking forward to seeing what you make next. It's a really exciting moment in your career, and I think fantastic that we could capture this really important time. in this interview. So thank you for joining Design Dialogue. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Glenn. It's always a pleasure getting to chat with you. I feel like you're able to kind of like, you know, I'm able to like explore thoughts and ideas about my work and my practice that, you know, until points like this are just kind of in the catacombs of my mind, and now actually get a voice that can be shared with other people. So it's always a pleasure and always a benefit to me. And thank you also to Friedman Benda for hosting all of this. And yeah, I hope you know, I encourage you all to check out the show if you're in New York City. And yeah, I'm looking forward to just being back in the studio and continuing this conversation with the work I'm making there.
Great. Yeah, and as Alex says, have a great time at Peters Valley too. I hope
Nice, thank you, Alex.
Yeah. Okay, we're actually juggling our guests around for next week, so I'm not sure exactly who we're going to have on, but it'll be great, trust me. So come on back in a week, Wednesday, July 7th. I'll also say we are just going to be going through late July and then taking a little bit of a summer break, so we won't be on in August, just in case you're planning ahead. But back in the fall, of course. And last but certainly by no means least, thanks again, Evie. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
okay, bye everyone. Thanks.